The air hung thick and damp, tasting of high-octane jet fuel and freshly cut grass from the surrounding English countryside. Below, a sky of bruised, pewter-colored clouds, a small knot of men in dark, rain-slicked coats stood by the perimeter fence, their breath clouding in the chill air despite the midsummer date. They were silent, their focus locked on a squat, muscular aircraft sitting alone on the cracked concrete. This was no sleek, supersonic needle. Its nose was blunt, its wings were short and fixed high, and it had a unique, almost awkward stance on its landing gear. This was the Hawker Siddeley Harrier GR.1, and to much of the world, it was an expensive curiosity, a complex solution to a problem few nations believed existed. Squadron leader Jeff W. Smith, an angular man with a permanently skeptical crease etched into his brow, leaned against a wooden post, his gaze narrowed against the glare reflecting off the puddles. He felt the weight of expectation, and more acutely, the weight of international ridicule. For nearly a decade, the Harrier's development had been an engineering marvel to some and a standing joke to others. Its defining feature, the vertical/short takeoff and landing (V/STOL) capability, was a source of both its revolutionary promise and its profound dismissal. Today's demonstration was private, but the implications were public. Jeff checked his wristwatch, 1,400 hours. Across the way, a technician gave a final, hurried thumbs up. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Robbie J. Davies, a veteran with a reputation for both recklessness and surgical precision, was already sealed into the cockpit. The engines, a single, massive Rolls-Royce Pegasus turbofan, spooled up with a deep, grinding roar that seemed to shake the very soil beneath Jeff's worn leather boots. The sound was instantly distinct. Unlike conventional jets where thrust was directed solely backward, the Harrier had 4 colossal, swiveling exhaust nozzles, 2 mounted beneath the fuselage near the wings and 2 at the tail. As the throttle was pushed forward, a cloud of exhaust fumes and superheated air boiled violently beneath the aircraft, churning the water and loose gravel on the tarmac into a blinding horizontal spray. Then came the moment that, even after countless viewings, never failed to seize Jeff's attention. Instead of a long, accelerating dash down the runway, the Harrier simply rose. It lifted straight up, a sudden, vertical surge of pure physics, defying aeronautical convention. It hovered there, nose slightly pitched, a dark silhouette against the white sky, its pilot maintaining its position with minute-controlled bursts of thrust vectoring. The noise was deafening, a visceral, percussive pounding that vibrated in the chest cavity. "Still feels like sorcery, doesn't it, sir?" murmured an engineer next to Jeff, holding a clipboard against his chest. Jeff nodded slowly, but his mind was already miles and years away, across the Iron Curtain, where men with very different uniforms and very different objectives were watching, calculating, and, most importantly, scoffing. The Soviet doctrine was clear, simple, and overwhelmingly focused on scale, speed, and raw power. They viewed V/STOL as an inefficient, compromised technology. Their high-performance fighters, the MiG-21s, and the newer, terrifyingly fast MiG-23s, were built for altitude, speed, and conventional runways, long, reinforced strips of concrete capable of supporting thousands of sorties in a massive, overwhelming war of attrition. The idea of a specialized subsonic jump jet that traded speed and range for the ability to operate from a football field was seen as ludicrous, a distinctly Western preoccupation with niche scenarios. The mocking was not subtle. Soviet military journals often referred to the Harrier with dismissive epithets: the vertical toy, the hovering anomaly, or simply the gimmick. Marshal Andrei Semyonovich Zamyatin, a highly decorated Soviet Air Force commander known for his blunt analysis, was famously quoted in 1972 as saying that the Harrier was a very complex mechanism designed to do one thing: prove the British still have an aircraft industry. It is a brilliant spectacle, but a terrible weapon. It is slow, it is short-legged, and it is a gift for a dedicated SAM operator. Jeff watched as Robbie executed a precise, tight rotation, the Harrier pivoting on its own axis before transitioning, seamlessly and almost violently, into forward flight. The massive thrust nozzles rotated aft, locking into position, and the jet accelerated with surprising quickness, banking steeply over the distant tree line and vanishing into the hazy distance for its short, pre-planned circuit. "A gift," Jeff muttered, quoting the marshal's famous insult under his breath. He watched the direction the Harrier had vanished. They call it a gift. They don't grasp the nature of the war we're planning for. They think in terms of a war that has already been won and lost, a war of massive frontal assaults. They don't understand the chaos. The true genius of the Harrier was not its ability to take off vertically in a parade. It was its ability to operate from dispersed operating sites, DOS. In the event of a full-scale Soviet invasion of Western Europe, the very first targets, the primary focus of a devastating initial nuclear or conventional barrage, would be the established conventional air bases. Runways would be cratered, hangars destroyed, and command and control structures rendered useless. NATO's primary air power would be eliminated in the first hour. But the Harrier didn't need a runway. It could be hidden beneath camouflage nets in a clearing in the Black Forest, nestled between barns on a West German farm, or, as the doctrine was now being tested, launched directly from straight, wide section of a public motorway, the kind of road the USSR never saw as a threat. That was the secret the British and NATO were banking on. While the Soviet MiGs were circling over smoking, unusable airfields, the Harriers would be rising from places the enemy couldn't bomb because they couldn't even target them. A single dedicated Harrier squadron could sustain a crucial, localized air presence that no other jet in the NATO inventory could match. Jeff, a planner long before he was a commander, saw the quiet revolution in the jet's hovering shadow. The Harrier wasn't designed for the war the Soviets expected. It was designed for the one they would unleash. The design philosophy behind the Harrier stood in stark opposition to the Soviet Air Force, or Vojennovozdechny Sily, VVS, doctrine of the 1970s. While NATO planners were meticulously crafting strategies for survival in a nuclear or conventionally cratered Central Europe, the VVS was preparing for the swift, overwhelming conquest of that same territory. Their strategy was built on the principle of deep operations, a rapid, mechanized thrust supported by massive air superiority, operating from sprawling, well-defended bases in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet heartland. For them, resilience was achieved through redundancy and sheer scale, not through boutique technological adaptation. In a windowless, smoke-filled briefing room deep within the command complex near Kubinka Air Base outside Moscow, Colonel Igor Volkov, a decorated pilot of the new MiG-23 Flogger and an instructor at the Air Force Academy, tapped a pointer against a wall map of Western Europe. His audience consisted of dozens of young, eager VVS officers, their faces dimly lit by the projector. The map was scarred with thick red arrows, all pointing relentlessly west. The Anglo-American concept, Volkov's voice was a low, resonant baritone, laced with professional contempt, is predicated on fear. They fear our first strike, so they invent mechanisms to hide. Mechanisms like this. He clicked a remote, and the projector shifted to a grainy photograph of the Harrier hovering over a patch of grass. The young officers chuckled, a practiced, respectful wave of derision. "Look at it," Volkov continued, his tone dry. "It is a vertical snail. Its maximum speed is barely supersonic, Mach 1.1 on a good day, and never in a combat configuration. Compare this to your aircraft, the MiG-23, which can achieve Mach 2.3. It carries a payload barely capable of striking a truck column, while your aircraft carries enough ordnance to destroy a fortified company. Its radius of action, even with external tanks, is pitiful, is constantly chained to a refueling point or a hiding spot." Volkov's analysis, while brutally honest about the Harrier's performance envelope, missed the fundamental point of its existence. He focused on the aircraft and not the mission. In the VVS lexicon, a fighter must dominate the skies and achieve deep strikes. The Harrier was neither. It was designed to provide close air support, CAS, and limited air defense locally, maintaining the crucial battle line integrity when everything else had been annihilated. The Soviet mockery intensified because they viewed the Harrier's required technology as inherently flawed and fragile. The complex nozzle vectoring system of the Pegasus engine required immense maintenance, constant checks, and highly specialized ground crews. In the muddy, frozen reality of a Central European conflict, the VVS saw the system quickly clogging with dirt, grit, and ice, leading to catastrophic engine failure. The VVS had, in fact, experimented with V/STOL technology itself. The Yak-38 Forger, a dedicated vertical takeoff and landing aircraft for deployment on Soviet aircraft carriers, was the VVS's answer. However, the Yak-38 was notoriously temperamental, dangerously prone to engine difficulties in hot weather, and suffered from a vastly limited payload and range, even more so than the Harrier. The internal VVS conclusion was that V/STOL was simply too complex and too inefficient for widespread combat use. Because their V/STOL effort had proven disappointing, they projected that failure onto the Harrier. It became an ideological point. If Soviet engineering could not perfect it for tactical use, Western engineering certainly could not. Volkov turned back to the map, his hand resting on the border between West and East Germany. They planned to hide their little toys in the forests, on the autobahns. He spat the German word out with disdain. This is their folly. They believe a road is a replacement for a military airfield. A road is easily interdicted. A road is easily bombed. Our planning dictates that in the first 4 hours of engagement, our strategic missile troops and our dedicated frontal aviation will render every established NATO airbase useless. Every single one. He paused, letting the scope of the destruction sink in. But we do not stop there. We saturate the rear areas. We use Spetsnaz reconnaissance and long-range conventional ordnance to strike every known or suspected dispersed operating location. Their Harriers might lift off from field, yes, but they still need fuel, they still need ordnance, and they still need a support crew. They're not ghosts. They are vulnerable logistical trains on a public road, and we will hunt them until they are merely burning wreckage in the mud. This was the Soviet counter-doctrine. Deny the dispersed operating site, DOS, its support structure. The VVS genuinely believed that the moment a Harrier took off from a forest road, it would mark its own grave. The roar of the Pegasus engine would be a beacon for reconnaissance aircraft. The necessary fuel trucks would be prime targets, and the exposed ground crew would be easy prey for fast-moving armored columns or airborne assault troops. The Harrier's initial V/STOL advantage was seen as a temporary, fleeting benefit, easily overcome by superior Soviet numbers, speed, and doctrine. For Colonel Volkov and the VVS, the Harrier was an intellectual distraction, a sideshow from the real war that would be fought at Mach 2. The irony, completely lost on the officers in the cold Kubinka briefing room, was that this very dismissal, this assumption that the Harrier's operation was too complex and too exposed to be effective, was precisely what made the aircraft so dangerous. Complacency is the precursor to surprise, and the West was counting on the element of surprise. The West's counterplan, the doctrine of dispersed operations, was an exercise in radical asymmetry, a deliberate exploitation of Soviet rigidity. If the Soviets were planning to fight a war of grand air bases and sweeping front lines, NATO would turn the conflict into a partisan, decentralized struggle fought in the hidden corners of the continent. The proving ground for this revolutionary concept was West Germany, specifically the dense, dark expanse of the Black Forest. By the mid-1970s, the Royal Air Force, RAF Germany, had established a series of classified, interlocking training exercises across the region. These were not the typical maneuvers involving roaring jets taking off from the massive runways of RAF Gütersloh or Wildenrath. Instead, they focused on small, elite teams in the Harrier, teaching them how to melt into the civilian landscape. The RAF's mantra became simple. If they can't see it, they can't bomb it. Wing Commander Alistair "Ally" K. MacLeod, a pragmatic Scot with an engineering degree and a combat pilot's instincts, commanded one of the first squadrons dedicated entirely to this unorthodox warfare. His unit, based notionally at RAF Larbruch, spent 3 weeks out of every month living off the grid. They traded the comfort of steel hangars for the damp seclusion of Baden-Württemberg's pine forests. Ally MacLeod and his team, a tightly knit group of 20 ground crew, 6 pilots, and 3 security teams, redefined their concept of an airfield. It was no longer a half-mile of concrete. It was any stretch of firm, level ground about 50 feet wide and 100 yards long. This could be a forest clearing, a hard-packed gravel parking lot behind a massive factory, or, critically, a specific segment of the German Autobahn designated by painted white lines as a wartime operating strip. The operations themselves were an astonishing study in logistics minimized. A single Harrier, loaded with 2 30mm Aden cannon pods and perhaps a pair of AM-9 Sidewinder missiles for air defense, needed 3 primary things: fuel, ordnance, and a tiny footprint. The fuel, highly volatile aviation kerosene, was brought in by a civilian-looking Mercedes truck towing a camouflage tank trailer. The ordnance was kept in small, reinforced concrete culverts buried into the earth, covered by heavy timber and foliage. The entire ground support operation, from refueling to rearming, was designed to be completed by a skeleton crew in under 20 minutes before the telltale heat signature of the Pegasus engine could attract attention. One key element of the dispersal strategy was the psychological element, the ability to disappear. The Harriers were painted with disruptive camouflage, dark greens, browns, and blacks designed specifically for the Central European woodland. The crews were trained in advanced field craft by elements of the Special Air Service, SAS, learning how to conceal themselves, move silently, and operate under blackout conditions. They rarely spoke on traditional radio frequencies, relying instead on high-speed burst transmission data links to receive their mission coordinates, a 10-second burst of digital code that was impossible for the Warsaw Pact to triangulate effectively. Ally MacLeod recalled one particularly challenging exercise in the autumn of 1976, codenamed Operation Squirrel Cage. The objective was for a 4-ship flight of Harriers to operate from 4 separate, pre-selected sites in a 70-square-mile area for 72 consecutive hours, maintaining a constant state of readiness. Soviet recce flights, MiG-25R, were simulated by RAF Phantoms and Jaguars, flying precise, high-altitude surveillance patterns. MacLeod's Harrier, nestled in a small forest clearing no larger than a tennis court, was hidden by an elaborate, custom-built camouflage net system interwoven with hundreds of fresh pine branches. The engine was cold. The crew was silent. MacLeod, lying prone on a tarp beside the jet, watched as a German farmer drove his small, diesel tractor past the edge of the clearing, completely oblivious to the $10 million weapon of war 50 feet away. The Soviets, MacLeod explained later to a visiting NATO general, they are looking for a concrete target. A runway, a radar dish, a hangar. They're looking for the geometry of war they know. We give them nothing but trees and mud. They could drop 1,000 bombs, but unless they know exactly which tree is covering which jet, they are wasting their ordnance. And we will have launched and gone long before they can analyze a recon photo and send a strike package. The real test came when the alerts went out. MacLeod would receive his coded mission data. Strike mission, 2 tanks, coordinate Alpha 6 Delta, 10 minutes from launch. The ground crew would strip the camouflage net in a practiced, silent frenzy. The pilot would scramble into the cockpit. The Pegasus engine would ignite, filling the closed quarters of the forest with a blinding, roaring heat. And then, against the canopy of towering pines, the Harrier would lift straight up, accelerating vertically until it cleared the highest branches, leaving behind only the swirling dust and the scent of burnt kerosene and pine resin. The entire sequence, from cold silence to airborne, rarely exceeded 6 minutes. It was a phantom operation, a weapon materializing from the earth itself. It was the absolute antithesis of the VVS doctrine and it was the core of NATO's air survival strategy. While the VVS air commanders dismissed the Harrier on doctrinal grounds, the intelligence arm of the Soviet Union, the KGB and the GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate, took the concept of dispersed operating sites, DOS, with grim seriousness. The VVS saw a slow jet. The KGB saw a catastrophic disruption of their war planning. If NATO air power could survive the initial strike, even in small, localized pockets, the entire timetable for a swift armored thrust across West Germany would collapse into a costly, chaotic grind. By 1977, the KGB's first chief directorate, Foreign Intelligence, had escalated the hunt for information on the Harrier's operational doctrine to a priority one target in Western Europe. Agent nets across the UK and West Germany were tasked with nothing less than identifying the physical locations and logistical patterns of the RAF Germany Harrier squadrons. They were not looking for bases. They were looking for patches of road and forest clearings. The greatest concern centered on the Autobahn operating strips. Across West Germany, NATO engineers had long collaborated with civilian transportation agencies to ensure specific aerostraight stretches of the federal highway network were built to military specifications. These segments, often several miles long and completely devoid of overpasses, guardrails, or central dividers, were designed to be converted into temporary runways, or, more accurately, V/STOL pads, within hours. This was the ultimate expression of the DOS concept, turning the mundane infrastructure of peacetime into the essential theater of wartime operations. The KGB's chief resident in Bonn, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, no relation to the VVS colonel, considered these road strips the single most vulnerable point in NATO's defensive depth. A conventional airbase was easy to spot and hard to destroy completely. A highway operating strip was easy to bomb with precision once its location was known, and its use made the Harriers logistically dependent on a linear, exposed corridor. Volkov's most successful asset in this hunt was a deep-cover operative codenamed Sparrow, a low-level transportation ministry official who had access to municipal planning documents. Sparrow wasn't a spy in the traditional sense. He was a disillusioned bureaucrat paid handsomely for copies of blueprints, construction schedules, and internal memos related to highway maintenance. These documents, seemingly innocuous on their surface, contained the precise specifications of the road segments, thickness of the concrete slab, load-bearing capacity, and, critically, the location markers for the temporary V/STOL launch points. In a small, poorly lit safe house in Cologne, Volkov pored over the maps Sparrow had provided. He traced the lines of the A7, the A9, and the A3, the major north-south and east-west arteries. He wasn't looking for secret military installations. He was looking for long, straight lines of road where the median barrier mysteriously disappeared for a few kilometers. He circled dozens of sections, matching the geographical features to high-resolution satellite imagery provided by Soviet reconnaissance satellites. The resulting intelligence package, marked Special Handling, Top Secret, VVS/GRU circulation only, contained the exact coordinates of over 40 potential Harrier operating sites. This information fundamentally changed the Soviet target package. Now, instead of just bombing 10 major air bases, the Soviet opening move would include a massive wave of Scud missiles and Tupolev Tu-16 Badger bombers targeting these specific kilometer-long road segments. The goal was to crater the road surface to such an extent that V/STOL operations would be impossible due to foreign object damage, FOD, risk, and uneven ground. Yet, even with this detailed intelligence, a profound degree of Soviet intellectual arrogance persisted within the VVS. Colonel Volkov in Kubinka, upon receiving the KGB report, treated the list not as a critical threat, but as confirmation of the enemy's desperation. The British are playing a game of hide-and-seek, he lectured his staff. They're wasting millions on making an aircraft that can operate from an inconvenience. We have the maps. We have the coordinates. We simply assign a squadron of Su-24 fencers to each sector and eliminate the target. They can hide in a field but they cannot hide their logistical chain, and they cannot hide the ground they need to take off from. He believed that even a slight delay in the Soviet armored advance would allow NATO to reposition, so the elimination of these mobile air threats had to be swift, total, and guaranteed. The Soviet plan evolved from merely destroying air bases to systematically neutralizing the entire road network in the rear areas. What the KGB saw as a serious threat, the VVS interpreted as a tedious but manageable logistical problem to be solved with heavy ordnance and massive coordination. What neither organization fully grasped was the sheer flexibility of the RAF ground crews. The Harriers were not bound to the 40 segments the KGB had identified. Those were merely the most convenient ones. RAF operational plans included hundreds of improvised sites, country roads, industrial parks, and farm fields. Locations too numerous, small, and transient for even the most thorough KGB/GRU effort to map completely. The enemy was hunting for a fixed target when the target had learned how to move. The theoretical war plans hatched in the dark forests of West Germany and the briefing rooms of Kubinka were abruptly yanked into grim reality in April 1982. The Argentine invasion of the Falkland Islands, the Islas Malvinas, provided the ultimate, unplanned crucible for the Harrier concept, transforming it overnight from a controversial niche weapon into a vital, war-winning necessity. The logistical challenge faced by the British task force was colossal. To regain the islands, Britain had to project air power over 8,000 miles from Ascension Island, with the nearest suitable runway being nearly 4,000 miles away. The carriers dispatched, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, were too few, and their decks were too short for conventional fixed-wing jets like the Phantom. The V/STOL capability of the Sea Harrier FRS.1, the naval variant of the jet, was not just an advantage. It was the only viable option for maintaining air superiority. The lessons learned during the dispersal exercises in Germany translated directly to the harsh, wind-battered environment of the South Atlantic. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward and his squadron faced constant, high-stakes combat against Argentine A-4 Skyhawks and Mirage 3 fighters, but the greatest battle remained logistics and survivability. The carrier decks themselves became the ultimate dispersed operating sites. The Sea Harriers, lacking the powerful afterburner and high speed of their conventional opponents, had to rely on radar, maneuverability, and stealth at low altitudes, often operating in brutal weather conditions where conventional landing would be impossible. The V/STOL function allowed the jets to land vertically in heavy seas, on pitching and rolling decks, and often in conditions where the flight deck had been fouled by a near miss or fire damage. The reliability that Soviet experts had mocked, the fragile complexity, was proven rugged enough to withstand the corrosive salt spray, punishing cold, and intense operational tempo of a shooting war. Critically, the war demonstrated the short takeoff, STO, capacity using the ski jump ramp fitted to the carriers. By running the Harrier up the curved ramp, the aircraft was thrown into the air with enough upward momentum to dramatically reduce its required runway length and significantly increase its maximum fuel and weapon load. This turned the Sea Harrier into a lethal fighter bomber capable of carrying a full air-to-air missile complement and still challenging supersonic Argentine aircraft. The ultimate test of the dispersal doctrine, however, came after the British landings at San Carlos Water. As the conflict moved ashore, the need for forward air control became desperate. The small, rough landing strips that were hastily constructed near the landing zones were immediately vulnerable to Argentine bombardment. This is where the sheer adaptability of the Harrier was revealed. The ground crews, drawing on their training from the Black Forest exercises, began operating from Falkland sheep stations. At sites like Port Howard and Goose Green, the Harrier JR.3S, the RAF ground attack version flown in to reinforce the Sea Harriers, were tucked into muddy fields adjacent to barns and rock walls, utilizing the terrain to break up their heat signatures and hide from observation. They operated from mats of aluminum planking laid down on marshy ground, or simply from the rough, compacted earth. These forward operating bases, FOBs, were transient. They shifted every 24 to 48 hours. They were supplied by helicopters, and the ground crews lived in near-constant exposure to the elements and the risk of enemy special forces infiltration. But they kept the Harriers in the air, providing invaluable close air support to the ground troops. An Argentine attack on a British position might trigger an immediate response from a Harrier launched only 3 miles away, a response time impossible for a jet operating from a distant carrier. The VVS's core critique, that the Harrier was too slow, too short-legged, and too dependent on a vulnerable logistical train, collapsed entirely under the reality of the Falklands campaign. The Harrier didn't need Mach 2. It needed to be where the fight was quickly. It didn't need massive range. It needed to strike targets within its combat radius, return to a nearby, temporary hideout, and be rearmed and refueled before the enemy could zero in on its fleeting location. The war proved that the inherent mobility of the V/STOL jet was its true protection. The Falklands campaign was the live-fire demonstration of NATO's DOS strategy. The performance was undeniable. The Sea Harriers achieved 20 air-to-air kills with 0 losses to enemy aircraft. The Harrier GR.3S delivered critical ordnance that tipped the balance in numerous ground battles. The little jet, the vertical toy that had been mocked, had won air superiority thousands of miles from the nearest conventional runway, operating under conditions no other fighter of its generation could have tolerated. The news reports flowing back to Moscow were detailed, and they were alarming. The contempt had to be reevaluated. The victory of the Harrier in the South Atlantic was not merely a military setback for the Soviet Union, who were quietly supplying the Argentine military with satellite intelligence and advanced anti-ship missile technology. It was a profound intellectual defeat for the VVS doctrine. The reports coming from Soviet military attaches in Buenos Aires and intelligence summaries compiled by the KGB's analysis division in Yasenevo painted a clear, unsettling picture. The Harrier's vulnerability had been grossly overstated, and its operational resilience profoundly underestimated. Marshal Yuri M. Shishkin, the newly appointed deputy commander of the VVS Frontal Aviation, was tasked in late 1982 with conducting a top-to-bottom reevaluation of NATO's air survivability, codenamed Operation Kuznets, the Smith. Shishkin was a reformer, known for his relentless focus on operational realism over theoretical elegance. He commissioned a dedicated Special Analysis Group, SAG, drawing talent from the Air Force Academy, the GRU, and the Soviet Naval Aviation, which was intimately familiar with the failed complexities of the Yak-38. The SAG's final report on the Falklands was damning. It explicitly refuted the 4 central pillars of the VVS's Harrier mockery: fragility and maintenance. The report noted that despite the savage, corrosive environment, the Harrier's Pegasus engine proved remarkably durable. The British crews, highly trained for the austere DOS sites in Germany, managed to sustain sortie rates from the carrier decks that exceeded projections for far simpler conventional aircraft. The logistics, while lean, were effective. Vulnerability on the ground. The report highlighted the impossibility of targeting the transient, improvised operating sites used on the islands. The use of sheep stations and muddy fields demonstrated that the Harrier was not chained to the few Autobahn strips the KGB had mapped. It could literally operate from any firm, flat piece of ground. Combat ineffectiveness. The 20-to-0 air combat ratio was a statistical anomaly that could not be ignored. It proved the Sea Harrier, despite its subsonic speed, was a deadly dogfighter when piloted skillfully and equipped with a newly developed Blue Fox radar and modern heat-seeking missiles. The VVS had dismissed the Harrier as a ground attack platform. It had proven itself an effective air superiority fighter. Logistical interdiction. Crucially, the campaign demonstrated that a small, dedicated ground crew could self-sustain for short periods. The VVS had planned to interdict miles-long convoys. The RAF used 1 or 2 civilian-disguised trucks and low-flying helicopters. The logistical tail was not a vulnerability. It was a mobile, camouflaged extension of the weapon system itself. Marshal Shishkin personally presented the findings to the Defense Council. His voice, usually gruff, was measured and severe. "Comrades, we must accept a new reality. The enemy has found a mechanism to negate the decisive advantage of our first strike. If we bomb their air bases, their air support simply reconstitutes itself in a field 10 kilometers away, ready to engage our advancing mechanized columns. We have focused on destroying the airport. We should have focused on destroying every paved road and open field within the enemy's operational depth." The immediate consequence of the reassessment was a massive shift in Soviet counterplanning for the Central European Front. The focus changed from merely cratering runways to developing specialized anti-DOS operations. The Spetsnaz, Soviet Special Forces, received enhanced training and a new priority: deep reconnaissance and sabotage of forward support areas. Their mission was no longer limited to destroying communications towers. They were now required to penetrate enemy lines and locate, target, and destroy Harrier operating sites and their accompanying, highly mobile support vehicles. This involved learning to identify the minute signs of a recent V/STOL launch, scorched earth, tire tracks leading into dense forest, and the specific sound profile of the Pegasus engine during liftoff. Furthermore, the VVS began deploying more recce strike packages. Dedicated flights of reconnaissance aircraft followed immediately by fighter bombers, attempting to catch a Harrier during its crucial 15-minute rearming cycle. Their doctrine was adapted. If the Harrier could not be found with conventional imagery, they would saturate known DOS areas with cluster munitions, designed to turn a vast area of field or forest into an unusable landscape of unexploded ordnance and debris. The mockery had ceased. It had been replaced by a focused, desperate determination to nullify the Harrier's unique survival trait. The Soviet realization of the Harrier's capability coincided with a pivotal shift in NATO training. No longer was the dispersed operating site, DOS, a theoretical exercise for a few specialized RAF units. It became the centerpiece of NATO's air power survival strategy in the central region. The RAF's operations in Germany were formalized into massive, full-scale maneuvers designed to test the limits of dispersal and survivability under simulated nuclear exchange conditions. One of the most critical of these exercises was Operation Blazing Scythe, conducted across the vast plains and forests of Lower Saxony and Hesse in the autumn of 1984. Wing Commander Ally MacLeod, now promoted and commanding a wing of 3 Harrier squadrons, was the operational architect of the exercise. His mandate was simple: prove that the RAF could sustain 100 sorties per day for 7 consecutive days, with 0 losses on the ground, operating entirely from dispersed locations. This meant turning every usable piece of German infrastructure into a temporary, armed launch site. The exercise began with a simulated massive Warsaw Pact airstrike that supposedly obliterated all conventional NATO air bases, including MacLeod's nominal headquarters at Wildenrath. The moment the klaxons sounded, the 40-odd Harriers and their accompanying support vehicles scattered, vanishing into the German landscape. The logistics involved were a staggering effort in coordination and camouflage. The RAF utilized everything: Autobahn sections closed down by the German police and rapidly cleared of street furniture, factory parking lots adjacent to industrial parks, stretches of abandoned railway track, and, most frequently, prepared forest clearings that had been quietly widened and reinforced over years. The most dramatic phase of Blazing Scythe involved the simultaneous activation of 6 different Autobahn strips within a single hour. Each strip required a rapid transformation: mobile command posts disguised as construction vans, dozens of fuel tankers, often civilian contractor vehicles, and the carefully choreographed placement of ordnance trucks carrying BL.755 cluster bombs and AM-9L sidewinders. The crews worked under intense pressure, monitored by dedicated exercise enemy forces, British Army reconnaissance teams simulating Spetsnaz, who were determined to catch them with an engine running or a fuel hose exposed. At the A-44 strip near Kassel, Flight Lieutenant Mark Flash Peterson waited for his turn to launch. His Harrier Jar .3 was positioned in a designated blast-resistant revetment made of earth and concrete blocks hastily assembled by Army engineers. Above him, a USAF RF-4C Phantom, simulating a MiG-25R reconnaissance flight, screamed overhead, attempting to capture photographic proof of the location. 5 minutes to launch. The ground crew chief, a grizzled sergeant named Davies, yelled over the rising whine of the Pegasus engine. The noise on the open Autobahn was phenomenal, echoing off the surrounding trees and hills, precisely the beacon Colonel Volkov had predicted. But Flash Peterson knew that by the time the reconnaissance photos were analyzed and the Soviet strike package was vectored to the coordinates, he would be long gone, and the ground crew would be halfway to the next site. The actual launch from the road strip was a carefully controlled sequence of short takeoff, STO, not a full vertical launch. Using the road length, the Harrier would accelerate briefly to gain speed before the pilot momentarily vectored the thrust nozzles slightly forward of the vertical. This technique, called vectoring in forward flight, VFF, gave the jet a massive, controlled burst of lift, allowing it to get airborne with a much heavier payload of fuel and ordnance than a pure vertical launch would permit. Flash felt the brutal shove as the nozzle swiveled. The Harrier leaped off the road surface, clearing the towering highway signs that marked the temporary boundary. He transitioned to horizontal flight, already descending to treetop level, joining his wingmen who had launched seconds before. Their mission, a low-level, high-speed strike against a simulated enemy bridge crossing the Weser River 20 minutes away. The success of Blazing Scythe demonstrated that the V/STOL concept, when backed by dedicated logistics and specialized training, was not just viable, but profoundly resilient. The RAF lost several Harriers to simulated air-to-air engagements, but 0 aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair on the ground by enemy action. The dispersal strategy had protected the most vulnerable asset, the operational aircraft, during the crucial moments of a war's opening phase. The lesson resonated deeply across NATO. The Harrier was the anchor of air survival, the key to ensuring that, even after the apocalypse, the West could still fight back from the roadside. The success demonstrated in Operation Blazing Scythe hinged entirely on the ingenuity and discipline of the mobile air movements and logistics element, mammal, teams, the unsung heroes of the Harrier survivability. These were the ground crews, fuel handlers, armorers, and engineers who transformed a desolate patch of ground into a functioning forward operating base, FOB, and then dismantled it hours later, without leaving a trace that could be definitively targeted. Their work was the logistical shadow the Soviets were desperate to illuminate. The heart of the mammal effort was the immediate rearming and refueling, RAR, procedure, a high-stakes choreography perfected under the stress of countless drills. The philosophy was simple. The moment the Harrier's wheels touched down, it became a stationary target, and its operational life was measured in minutes. Sergeant Davies, the veteran crew chief from Flash Peterson's squadron, oversaw his team with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker. The entire IRAR kit was carried on 2 ruggedized, 3-ton military trucks, often painted with civilian logos or heavily camouflaged. The process of turning around a hot, thirsty Harrier began before the Pegasus engine had fully cooled. First, fuel. The process relied on a specialized, compact fuel pump system capable of transferring aviation kerosene at high volume. The fuel tankers themselves, known as whiskey wagons in slang, were never parked next to the jet. Instead, long, reinforced hoses were quickly run through natural cover, feeding the fuel into the Harrier's tanks. Davies' rule was absolute. The pumping process had to be completed in under 10 minutes. If enemy reconnaissance located them, the exposed fuel lines and the heat signature of the refueling Harrier were an irresistible target. At the 10-minute mark, whether full or not, the hoses came off and the whiskey wagon moved. Next, ordnance. Arming a jet with 2 1,000-pound bombs or 2 cluster bomb pods was heavy, awkward work, made infinitely harder in the dark, the mud, or the freezing rain typical of a German autumn. The ordnance was stored in small, shallow earth bunkers covered by heavy tarps and timber nearby. The armorers used specialized, hand-operated loading carts to wheel the weaponry out to the aircraft. They worked without speaking, communicating only through practiced hand signals, affixing the heavy munitions to the Harrier's underwing pylons. The noise of metal on metal was minimal. The risk of an accidental spark was absolute. Speed was essential, but precision was non-negotiable. A faulty fuse or an improperly seated bomb could lead to catastrophe mid-flight. Finally, camouflage. The Harrier never stayed in the same spot for more than a few hours. After the rearm and refuel, the jet was either launched on its next mission or, if the operational tempo allowed, towed a short distance to a new, carefully selected hiding spot. The ground crew specialized in disruptive netting and natural cover. They utilized local foliage, pine branches, dirt, straw, to break up the jet's unmistakable outline. Crucially, they focused on minimizing the telltale signs of recent operation, cleaning up fuel spills, covering the scorched earth left by the intense heat of the vertical blast, and raking over tire tracks left by the support vehicles. The training was relentless. Davies' team often worked 18-hour shifts, practicing the cycle until it became muscle memory. "We are not soldiers fighting a trench war," Davies would tell his young recruits. "We are ghosts. We arrive, we serve the jet, and we vanish. If you leave a cigarette butt or a trail of oil, you have given the enemy a map to your friends." This focus on transient, invisible operations created a profound headache for the Soviet anti-DOS strategists. Their entire intelligence gathering cycle, satellite reconnaissance, signal interception, photo analysis, and strike assignment, took hours. The Harrier's turnaround time was measured in minutes. Colonel Volkov, in Kubinka, now had to reckon with the fact that his fencer strike packages would often be arriving over a freshly raked piece of ground, finding nothing more than residual heat fading away and the scattered remnants of pine branches. The Harrier, the vertical toy, had forced the massive VVS to fight a war of ephemeral targets, forcing them to expend vast quantities of expensive ordnance on empty fields, desperately trying to catch a shadow that was already miles away, hidden under another patch of trees. This logistical shadow was the silent, devastating weapon that turned the Soviet mocking into genuine operational fear. The transition from intellectual contempt to operational anxiety in the Soviet camp was often driven by specific, unsettling intelligence, moments where the abstract threat of the Harrier became terrifyingly concrete. One such moment occurred during a high-stakes, low-level reconnaissance mission near the East-West German border in late 1985, an incident that profoundly affected a young Soviet pilot named Major Vadim S. Kalyagin. Kalyagin was an elite pilot in the VVS's dedicated reconnaissance regiment, flying the twin-engine, highly capable Su-24MR Fencer. His mission on that overcast November morning, codenamed Red Pencil, was to fly an ultra-low-altitude photographic sweep of a forested area in the West German state of Hesse, a region the KGB had flagged as potentially containing multiple, undeclared Harrier operating sites. His aircraft was laden with sophisticated optical and infrared cameras, flying so low that the trees often seemed to rush past the canopy glass in a blur of brown and green. Kalyagin had been briefed on the new anti-DOS strategy: fly fast, fly low, and look for the telltale signs of recent activity: the disturbed earth, the tracks of heavy vehicles, and the scorch marks from a Pegasus engine blast. He flew his assigned corridor twice, his heart pounding against his ribs from the physical and mental stress of navigating at 50 feet above ground level at nearly 600 knots. The first pass revealed nothing. The forest looked pristine, silent, and impenetrable. On his second pass, as he tore over a dense stretch of pine forest adjacent to a small, paved country road, the kind of road too narrow and winding to ever be considered a formal DOS strip, Kalyagin caught a flash of unnatural color. It was too quick to identify with the naked eye, but his high-speed film recorders captured it, a glimpse of dark green military netting partially concealing a vehicle, quickly covered by shadows. He didn't deviate his course, adhering strictly to the safety protocol, but on returning to the East German base at Zerbst, Kalaygin immediately flagged the anomaly. The film was rushed to the photo interpretation lab. Hours later, Kalaygin stood with a grim-faced GRU colonel, staring at a magnified, enhanced satellite photo taken by his aircraft's cameras. The photo was startlingly clear. In a tiny, irregularly shaped clearing connected to the minor road by a short, barely visible dirt track, sat a Hawker Siddeley Harrier GR.3. It was completely inert, tucked under camouflage netting, but its shape was unmistakable. Beside it, the silhouette of a fuel tanker, disguised with mud and tree branches, was visible. What truly horrified the colonel, and what chilled Kalaygin, was the location. This was not one of the pre-planned Autobahn strips the KGB had spent a decade mapping. This was simply a random, secluded patch of woodland, selected minutes before by a ground crew chief with an eye for natural cover. Its proximity to the main border was frightening. The jet was well within a 5-minute flight time of the potential front line. They are operating from anywhere, the GRU colonel whispered, the realization hitting him with physical force. We bombed their 40 pre-selected roads, and they moved to their 40,000 unselected roads. This changes everything. Kalaygin, the pilot, saw the operational implications instantly. The Harrier was a ghost. It did not emit powerful radar signals. It did not require the heavy infrastructure that generated obvious heat signatures. It was an infantry soldier's weapon, mobile, camouflaged, and capable of striking from ambush. He understood, then, why the VVS Mockery had been such a colossal strategic error. The Harrier didn't need to be fast or carry a huge payload. It only needed to survive the first day of the war. The intelligence from the Red Pencil mission caused a quiet but immediate panic in Moscow. It confirmed Shishkin's analysis. The NATO air threat was not a fixed, concrete target. It was a dispersed, liquid asset. The Soviet response was to drastically increase the training budget for its forward air controllers, FACs, attempting to create highly trained observers capable of calling in immediate, on-the-spot strikes the moment a Harrier was spotted on the ground, before it could disappear again. Major Kalaygin's discovery, born of a high-speed blur over a minor country lane, finally shattered the VVS's intellectual armor. The vertical toy was no longer a joke. It was a tangible threat, hiding in the forests, ready to rise from the dust and mud to strike at the heart of the Soviet ground invasion. With the threat of the Harrier confirmed to be everywhere and nowhere, the Soviet doctrine of neutralizing the dispersed operating sites, DOS, shifted from a primarily aerial bombing campaign to a highly specialized, boots-on-the-ground contest for the rear areas. The battle for the skies would be fought in the shadows of the Black Forest, pitting the stealth and savagery of the Soviet Spetsnaz against the resourcefulness and discipline of the RAF mobile air movements and logistics element, mammal, teams. The new Spetsnaz mission, integrated into the larger Soviet war plan, was known as Operation Bare Earth. Elite reconnaissance and sabotage detachments were trained specifically to penetrate deep into West German territory, bypassing the front lines to hunt down the Harrier support units. Their training focused heavily on identifying the minuscule signs of a recent V/STOL launch. Not just the scorch marks, but the precise pattern of broken foliage, the specific tread marks left by the unique Harrier support vehicles, and the residual electronic emissions from the burst transmission radios. The Spetsnaz operators, often disguised in civilian clothing or neutral nation uniforms, were instructed to avoid direct confrontation where possible. Their primary objective was sabotage. If they located an operational Harrier site, the orders were precise: destroy the fuel source first, then the ordnance bunkers, and only then, if possible, damage the aircraft itself. A Harrier without fuel or bombs was just as effectively neutralized as a destroyed one, without the risk of alerting nearby NATO patrols through loud explosions or sustained gunfire. The enemy was to be strangled, not merely shot. In response, the RAF ground crews and their security detail, often provided by the RAF regiment, had to escalate their defensive posture from camouflage and concealment to active, armed defense. Wing Commander Ally McLeod instituted a radical change in operational procedure: continuous, multi-layered security, CMS. CMS meant that every single DOS site, no matter how temporary, was treated as a potential combat zone. The security perimeter was established in 3 concentric layers. The inner ring, directly around the Harrier and its immediate support equipment. This was manned by the core mammal team, armed with personal weapons, trained for rapid, close-quarters defense, and ready to immediately start the engine and launch the aircraft if the position was compromised. The middle ring, a tight 100-meter perimeter manned by RAF regiment troops in heavily camouflaged fighting positions, equipped with night vision devices and designated to intercept any probing reconnaissance team. Their orders were to engage silently, using suppressed fire to avoid attracting larger forces. The outer ring, the tripwire, a sprawling, irregular perimeter extending up to a kilometer away, often utilizing simple, non-metallic tripwires, infrared sensors, and highly trained patrol dogs. The purpose of this layer was early detection, to give the inner team the 10 to 15 critical minutes needed to get the Harrier into the air before the main Spetsnaz assault could arrive. One exercise in 1986, Operation Vigilant AXE, specifically simulated this Spetsnaz threat. An elite detachment of the British SAS played the role of the Soviet commandos, given the task of infiltrating a Harrier DOS hidden deep in the Eifel Mountains. The SAS team, masters of stealth, moved through the rugged terrain for 36 hours before locating the camouflage site. The SAS successfully bypassed the outer ring by crawling through dense undergrowth, but were detected when one operator accidentally snagged a nearly invisible tension wire sensor in the middle ring. The resulting confrontation, though simulated with paint cartridges, was savage and swift. The RAF regiment troops reacted instantly, deploying smoke and flares to disorient the attackers, while the mammal team, under the command of Sergeant Davies, immediately began the engine start procedure. In the confusion, 2 Harriers were airborne within 6 minutes, leaving the remaining security force to mop up the enemy. The exercise revealed the brutal truth. The Harrier could not be protected forever, but it could be protected long enough. The SAS reported back that the depth of the security and the instantaneous reaction of the ground crews made the destruction of a stationary Harrier a high-risk, low-probability undertaking. The battle for the rear area was thus redefined as a race against time. The Spetsnaz had to find, identify, and close the distance before the engine roared to life. The mammal teams had to be hyper-alert and able to launch the jet at the first sign of trouble. The Harrier had not only forced the Soviets to change their air-to-ground doctrine, but had fundamentally altered their special forces strategy, turning every refueling stop into a potential firefight and every fuel truck into a strategic target. The game of hide-and-seek was now played with live ammunition and deadly intent. Despite the grudging respect earned by the Harrier's survivability, the Soviet Air Force, VVS, still held fast to the notion that the jet's operational limitations created an aviation ghetto. While they recognized the necessity of neutralizing the dispersal threat, they consistently argued that the Harrier, due to its V/STOL physics, operated within performance constraints that inherently limited its combat effectiveness compared to their supersonic conventional fighters. This analysis, led by Marshal Shishkin's team, continued to inform Soviet pilot training and engagement doctrine. The core of the VVS critique focused on the payload/range penalty. The Harrier's vertical takeoff, VTOL, the feature that made dispersal possible, was also its greatest compromise. To lift straight up, the Pegasus engine needed to devote its entire thrust capacity to overcoming gravity. This meant that the Harrier could only take off vertically with an extremely light fuel and weapons load. The maximum weight for a pure VTOL sortie was often only enough for a short, defensive air patrol or a minimal strike package. Conversely, for the Harrier to carry a tactically relevant payload, e.g., bombs, rockets, and full fuel tanks for deeper strikes, it was forced to revert to a short takeoff, STO. This STO required a run-up of several hundred feet, even with the VIFF, vectoring in forward flight technique. This requirement, though small compared to a conventional runway, significantly restricted the number of truly improvised operating sites, ruling out small, muddy farm fields or short, winding roads. The Soviet analysis formalized these findings. Limited defensive radius. When performing VTOL from a deep forest site, the safest dispersal method, the Harrier's radius of action was severely curtailed. The VVS calculated that a VTOL Harrier could only effectively engage targets within a 50 to 80-mile radius, forcing them to operate right near the front lines, exposing them to short-range air defense systems, SAMs, and intensive flak. Subsonic engagement. The Harrier's top speed was marginally supersonic, but its combat speed, when carrying ordnance and maneuverable, was firmly in the subsonic regime. This made the Harrier a predictable target for high-speed interceptors like the MiG-2327 and the newer MiG-29. The VVS trained its pilots to use their massive speed advantage to engage the Harrier with slash-and-run tactics, never lingering to dogfight within the Harrier's unique turning radius. Vulnerability during transition. The most dangerous moments for the Harrier were takeoff and landing. During the transition phase, the crucial seconds when the nozzles were moving from vertical to horizontal thrust, the jet was slow, highly vulnerable to wind shear, and unable to perform high-G evasive maneuvers. The VVS doctrine prioritized striking the Harrier during its return to the DOS site, when the pilot was exhausted and the fuel was low, forcing a slow, careful landing. Colonel Vitaly V. Chernov, a VVS tactical instructor, encapsulated this Soviet perspective in a classified training film. The Harrier is a cunning creature, but it is bound by gravity. It can hide anywhere, yes, but it cannot escape its physical limitations. When a Harrier takes off with a full load, it needs a straight road, which makes it predictable. When it takes off vertically, it is too light to be an effective attacker. The British have traded operational security for combat power. We must exploit the resulting performance window. This sustained technical critique was not just philosophical, it directly influenced Soviet anti-Harrier equipment. The Soviets accelerated the development of radar-guided proximity-fused artillery shells designed to detonate in the air over suspected DOS sites, raining shrapnel onto aircraft preparing for STO. They also emphasized low-observable, long-range reconnaissance drones, a nascent technology in the mid-1980s, to persistently monitor the wide Autobahn strips, waiting for the moments when the Harriers had to use them for their heavy-load missions. The mockery had morphed into a sober, analytical acceptance of the Harrier's survival ability, coupled with the conviction that its inherent combat weakness could be systematically exploited. The Soviets had learned to respect the Ghost, but they believed they knew the Ghost's rules and limitations, and they were ready to punish any deviation from them. The final confrontation, they assumed, would not be fought over a runway, but within the narrow performance margins dictated by the Harrier's remarkable but constrained engine. The VVS analysis concerning the Harrier's aviation ghetto was academically sound, based on pure physics, but it failed to account for the single most transformative operational technique developed by NATO pilots, vectoring in forward flight, VFF. This maneuver, perfected in the training skies above Germany, turned the Harrier's supposed weakness, its movable nozzles, into a decisive, asymmetric advantage in close-quarters air combat. The Soviets believed the subsonic Harrier was an easy target for their faster jets. The established Soviet doctrine for engaging the Harrier was a high-speed pass, firing a long-range missile or cannon burst, and immediately exiting the combat zone before the Harrier could turn its nose toward the threat. This relied on the predictable geometry of conventional jet maneuvers. VFF shattered that predictability. Flight Lieutenant Flash Peterson, the pilot who had demonstrated the STO on the Autobahn during Operation Blazing Scythe, became one of the foremost experts in using VFF offensively. He described the technique as giving the aircraft an invisible handbrake. In a conventional jet fight, a pilot changes direction by banking and pulling on the control stick, forcing the wings to bite into the air. This generates high G forces but takes time and distance. With the Harrier, The pilot could momentarily swivel the 4 thrust nozzles forward and down while flying at high speed. This sudden, massive downward vectoring of thrust created an instantaneous deceleration, a force that worked entirely independently of the aircraft's aerodynamic control surfaces. Imagine a MiG-23 flown by a confident pilot like Major Kalayagan attacking a Harrier from the rear. The MiG, flying at a high Mach number, is committed to a firing solution. The Harrier pilot, Flash Peterson, watches the MiG close in. Just as the MiG pilot prepares to fire, Flash momentarily slams the thrust lever and vectors his nozzles to 45 degrees forward. The effect is dramatic and instantaneous. The Harrier brakes violently, losing hundreds of knots of airspeed in less than a second, virtually standing still in the sky. The pursuing MiG, locked onto the Harrier's previous trajectory, sails uncontrollably past the decelerating jet. In the time it takes the surprised MiG pilot to realize his error and initiate a turn, Flash is already revectoring his nozzles rearward, accelerating, and is now perfectly positioned in the enemy's vulnerable 6 o'clock, the ideal position for a missile lock or cannon burst. The hunter has become the hunted. The VVS pilots were trained to engage targets based on speed and turn radius, the conventional rules of engagement. VFF introduced a third, wholly unexpected dimension: instantaneous deceleration and maneuverability in the vertical axis. The Harrier could turn tighter and brake harder than any conventional jet in the world, allowing it to dictate the terms of the short, brutal dogfight. Intelligence of the effectiveness of VIFF began to leak back to Moscow through captured pilot debriefings and detailed analysis of RAF Germany training films. The VVS was forced to develop entirely new countermeasures. They had to train their pilots to ignore the visual sight picture when engaging a Harrier and instead rely on radar lock and a massive buffer distance. Their pilots were explicitly instructed: never commit to a close-range pursuit of a Harrier. The subsonic gimmick was simply too dangerous to approach. This change in Soviet combat doctrine represented the deepest humiliation. A supersonic air force was forced to treat a subsonic jet with the utmost caution. The Harrier, through the clever use of its thrust vectoring, had neutralized the Soviets' single greatest advantage, speed, in the critical air-to-air environment over the front lines. The aviation ghetto had been turned into a trap for the aircraft that flew too fast. The Harrier was proving to be a multi-layered surprise. Its survivability was an answer to Soviet first strike, and its VFF capability was an answer to Soviet air superiority. The combination meant that the Soviet Union could neither reliably destroy NATO's crucial close air support on the ground nor effectively sweep it from the skies once it was airborne. The simple, awkward V/SDOL jet was rapidly becoming the single most disruptive non-nuclear element in the Central European theater. The strategic importance of the Harrier's unique capabilities coalesced over the most probable and critical invasion route in Central Europe, the Fulda Gap. This corridor of lowlands between the Hessian Mountains and the Rhone Mountains was where NATO expected the main armored thrust of the Soviet group of Soviet forces in Germany, GSFG, to punch through the defensive lines and race towards the Rhine River. For NATO, holding the Fulda Gap was everything. For the Harrier, this was the ultimate testing ground of its design philosophy. The Soviet doctrine called for a massive, overwhelming armored and mechanized assault through the gap. They would achieve air superiority first, then unleash their ground forces with dedicated MiG-27 Fogarty ground attack aircraft providing overwhelming close air support, SAS. The VVS plan assumed that by the time the Soviet tanks reached the main defensive lines, NATO's organic air support would be non-existent, cratered on the runways or shot down by high-speed interceptors. The Harrier was specifically integrated into the Central Army Group, CENTAG, defense plans to thwart this assumption. The RAF's dispersed squadrons were not intended to achieve air superiority over the entire front, but rather to ensure localized air presence over the Fulda Gap's most contested sectors, providing crucial, immediate CAS and battlefield interdiction that would otherwise be impossible. The operational plan was simple: survive the first 48 hours. The Harriers would launch from their hidden forest or Autobahn sites well behind the initial fighting, flying extremely low-level missions through the valleys and wooded terrain. Their role was to buy time for NATO reserves to mobilize and counterattack, specifically by targeting the Soviet armored spearheads and the critical logistical choke points, bridges, command posts, and fuel dumps that powered the deep offensive. Wing Commander Ally McLeod's squadrons trained relentlessly in the geography of the Fulda Gap. Their pilots memorized the winding river courses, the isolated farmhouses, and the precise elevation of the valleys. A typical mission during the annual Reforger, return of forces to Germany, exercises would involve a 4-ship flight of Harriers launching from a highway strip near Frankfurt, streaking across the gap at 50 feet altitude, firing ordnance at simulated T-72 tank columns, and then immediately landing at 4 different pre-designated farm fields for a rapid rearm and refuel, sometimes less than 30 miles from the front line. The immediacy of the Harrier's operation was the crucial factor. A conventional NATO jet might take 45 minutes to launch from a surviving base in the Netherlands and reach the Fulda Gap. A Harrier could be airborne from a Hessian forest clearing, strike a target, and be on the ground refueling in less than 20 minutes total, a response time that the Soviet ground commanders were completely unable to account for in their fast-moving, high-tempo offensive plans. The VVS commanders, forced to integrate the Harrier threat into their plans, were deeply frustrated. Marshal Shishkin, reviewing the Reforger data, noted the severe disruption caused by the RAF's operational speed. Every time our advance forces approached the critical crossing points, he reported, the British toys emerge from the trees, deliver their payload, and vanish. They force our main force to halt and divert resources. Our most advanced surface-to-air missile units and our specialized attack helicopters to guard the rear, slowing the entire tempo of the deep operation. The Harrier is an accelerated spoiler. The focus shifted to preemptive strikes, not just on the DOS sites themselves, but on the access routes leading to them. The VVS began to plan for massive, preemptive artillery barges and air-delivered mines to sow chaos on the country roads and fire breaks in the regions surrounding the Fulda Gap. They sought to deny the ground crews the ability to move between sites, hoping to trap the Harriers in place. However, the relentless adaptability of the RAF meant they were already moving beyond fixed sites. They began experimenting with mobile operating stations, MOS, large trucks, or modified articulated trailers carrying prepackaged fuel and ordnance, capable of driving off-road and supporting a Harrier in any large, relatively flat field, thereby neutralizing the threat of fixed-site interdiction. The Harrier's silent promise was realized in the most dangerous place on the planet. It guaranteed that the Soviet tank commander, even after the most devastating first strike, would never look up without fearing the shadow of a British jet emerging from the tree line. The mockery was gone. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the ghost in the forest, remained. The Soviet military's transition from mocking to strategic fear crystallized into a desperate, focused counterdoctrine centered on creating a literal firebreak in the rear areas of the potential NATO defense zone. Since they could not reliably track and destroy the moving Harrier, the VVS and the Soviet ground forces, SV, decided they must destroy the ground itself. Their goal was to render every suitable patch of land, whether a paved road, a forest clearing, or a cultivated field, unusable for V/STOL operations. This doctrine, developed in the late 1980s, shifted the Soviet focus from precision bombing to area denial. The key weapon in this strategy was the extensive, devastating use of cluster munitions and scatterable mines, delivered by air and long-range artillery. The Soviet RBK 500 series cluster bombs and the long-range BM-27 Urigan multiple rocket launcher system were earmarked for this purpose. Their war plan now included a sustained second-wave barrage behind the front lines, targeting broad geographical sectors that contain known or suspected DOS networks. These weapons were not designed to destroy specific aircraft. They were designed to saturate an area with thousands of submunitions and anti-personnel anti-vehicle mines. Major Kalayagan, the reconnaissance pilot who had previously detected the hidden Harrier site, was now involved in testing the effectiveness of this denial strategy. His Fencer E would fly post-strike photo runs over simulated firebreak zones in the massive Soviet training grounds in Poland. What he saw was often worse than complete destruction. A field hit by a cluster barrage was not simply cratered. It was peppered with small, insidious anti-personnel mines and unexploded bomblets. It is an invisible wound on the earth, Kalayagan noted in his reports. A crater is visible, and the engineers can fill it. But a field covered in cluster remnants is poisoned. The ground crew cannot walk on it. The jet cannot land on it for fear of foreign object damage, FOD, to the engine, and the support vehicles cannot drive across it. It makes a perfect field of grass utterly useless for a Harrier. It forces them to move, constantly, into areas further away from the front line, which drains their already limited fuel capacity. The doctrine included specific tactics aimed at exploiting the Harrier's Achilles heel, the sensitive Pegasus engine. The greatest fear of any V/STOL pilot is FOD, sucking up debris, gravel, or shrapnel during the violent, low-altitude launch or landing procedure. By scattering sharp, metallic shrapnel and mines across a wide area, the Soviets created a massive, systemic FOD risk that could disable a Harrier even without a direct hit. Furthermore, the Soviet planners focused on the Autobahn strips, instead of bombing them once, which could be quickly repaired by NATO engineers with specialized concrete repair kits. The Soviets planned to use targeted artillery strikes to mine the periphery of the road strips and the adjacent clearings. This would deny the ground crews the crucial area needed to set up their IRAR, immediate rearming and refueling stations, forcing them to operate right on the exposed pavement of the highway itself. The pressure from this firebreak strategy forced the RAF to adapt once again. They introduced heavy, modular metal planking, similar to the mats used in the Falklands, which could be rapidly deployed over a potential minefield to create a temporary, FOD-free operating surface. They also had to increase their collaboration with NATO engineering battalions to rapidly clear and neutralize contaminated land, adding yet another layer of complexity and time to their already frantic operational cycle. The irony of the situation was profound. The Soviet Union, masters of massive, conventional warfare, were forced to use their most powerful, destructive weapons not on the enemy's fixed defenses, but on empty pieces of farmland and forest paths. The Harrier, the tiny, much-maligned jet, had successfully compelled the entire Soviet war machine to fundamentally alter its strategic targeting, expending vast resources just to deny the enemy a place to land. The war of the air was now a war for the ground, a ground that was rapidly becoming hostile to any aircraft attempting to touch it. The final, and perhaps most critical, impact of the Harrier's operational doctrine was not tactical. It was strategic. By the late 1980s, the vertical toy had become a genuine, if unspoken, element of NATO's conventional deterrence. It fundamentally undermined the Soviet military's central strategic calculation for a war in Central Europe. The assumption of a swift, decisive victory achieved through the immediate neutralization of NATO air power. The entire Soviet warfighting plan, the meticulously crafted timetable for the invasion, was predicated on the collapse of NATO's air defense and close air support within the first 48 hours. This collapse would open a window of opportunity for the massive armored divisions of the GSFG to exploit. The Harrier, through its sheer resilience and dispersal capability, effectively guaranteed that this window would never fully open. Marshal Shishkin's final internal report before the collapse of the Warsaw Pact summarized this profound realization. He noted that even under the most optimistic projections of Soviet first strike success and firebreak effectiveness, NATO could still sustain 20% to 30% of its Harrier sortie rate from dispersed sites for the duration of a 7-day campaign. This is not air superiority, Shishkin wrote, but it is unacceptable resistance. A single Harrier sortie carrying cluster munitions into the flank of a rapidly advancing tank column can delay that column by hours as they deal with the immediate threat, the casualties, and the mines left behind. 20 or 30 such sorties per day, emerging unpredictably from the trees, introduces an unacceptable level of friction and chaos into our timetable. The Soviet military was structured to move fast. Delays were fatal to their deep operations doctrine. The Harrier guaranteed those delays. The jet had effectively weaponized the West German road network and forests, turning every patch of usable ground into a potential ambush point. This forced the VVS to tie up a significant portion of its dedicated strike and reconnaissance assets, valuable Su-24s and MiG-27s, in persistent, costly, and often fruitless anti-DOS patrols. These assets were thus unavailable for their intended primary mission of deep interdiction against NATO's reinforcing forces. The Harrier created a logistical and psychological drain on the Soviet offensive. Logistically, it forced the Soviets to dedicate scarce long-range artillery shells and advanced cluster munitions to bombing empty fields. Psychologically, it created an omnipresent fear among the tank crews and mechanized infantry that they were operating without reliable air cover, knowing that a British jet could materialize from the sky and strike without warning, then vanish before an air defense unit could acquire a lock. In essence, the Harrier changed the nature of the fight from a quantifiable war of attrition, where air bases could be counted and destroyed, to an unquantifiable war of insurgency, where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The initial mockery of the vertical toy had been based on the belief that conventional metrics, speed, range, and payload were the only measures of air combat power. The Falklands War, and more importantly, the rigorous training exercises in Germany, proved that survivability and operational immediacy were far more valuable in a total war scenario. The Harrier demonstrated that the best weapon in a war of annihilation is the one that simply refuses to be annihilated. The jet, designed in an era obsessed with supersonic speed, ended up proving the paramount importance of stealth and decentralization. It wasn't just an airplane. It was the physical embodiment of NATO's strategy to survive the first blow and maintain the ability to fight back, thereby raising the conventional cost of a Soviet invasion to a level the Kremlin could no longer confidently accept. The Harrier had, in its own quiet, vertical way, helped to keep the peace. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s did not erase the profound doctrinal lessons taught by the Harrier jump jet. In fact, the challenges it posed to the massive, centralized Soviet military machine became a crucial blueprint for modern air warfare survivability. The concept of dispersed operating sites, DOS, pioneered in the German forests, evolved into a central pillar of contemporary NATO and Western defense planning, proving that small, resilient units could decisively impact the calculations of a superpower. The Soviet Air Force, though facing its own dissolution, absorbed the lessons bitterly. The failure to negate the Harrier threat had forced costly and complex shifts in their deep strike and special forces strategies. While they never fully embraced V/STOL technology beyond the limitations of the naval Yak-38, the VVS significantly increased its investment in high-fidelity reconnaissance and sophisticated area denial weapons like cluster munitions, strategies explicitly developed to counter the Harrier's operational freedom. The legacy of the Harrier endured not in its specific design, but in the operational flexibility it demanded. The jet proved that the future of air power survivability lay in agility and mobility, rather than the static defense of massive, fixed bases. This concept was further validated in subsequent conflicts. When the United States and its allies faced asymmetrical threats, the ability to operate from improvised, austere locations became paramount. The Harrier's spiritual successor, the F-35B Lightning II, the V/STOL variant of a new Joint Strike Fighter, is the direct, ultimate evolution of the operational doctrine forged in the European theater. The F-35B incorporates lessons from the Harrier's constraints, It uses a lift fan and swiveling nozzles for V/STOL, but crucially, it is supersonic and integrates advanced stealth technology. The F-35B can not only operate from a hidden road or small ship deck, fulfilling the Harrier's DOS mission, but it can do so with the speed, range, and network-centric capabilities demanded by 21st century warfare. It is a stealthy ghost that can take off vertically and fly at Mach 1.6, addressing every single performance constraint the Soviet critics had focused on. The technology of the vertical toy was perfected to counter the very arguments that had once dismissed it. Furthermore, the rigorous training regimen developed by the RAF's mammal teams, the focus on sub-10-minute IRAR, immediate rearming and refueling, hypervigilant camouflage, and integrated ground defense, is now the foundation of modern agile combat employment, ACE, concepts used by the USAF and other air forces. ACE doctrine is simply the Harrier DOS strategy writ large, distributing aircraft and logistics across a wide area to complicate enemy targeting and increase operational resilience against a peer adversary. The Soviet pilots who had once mocked the Harrier as a slow, fragile curiosity lived to see their own doctrine strained and warped by its existence. Major Kalaygin, who had detected the Harrier in the forest clearing, understood better than most. The Harrier had revealed a fundamental weakness in the Soviet system, its inflexibility and its reliance on predictable large-scale infrastructure. The Harrier was finally retired from British service in 2011, a decision that remains controversial, yet its operational spirit is very much alive. It proved that the true measure of a weapon is not its maximum speed or payload, but its operational availability when the fighting is fiercest. The Harrier forced the Cold War to be fought on its terms, hidden in the trees, ready to rise on a vertical column of pure thrust, guaranteeing that the lights of NATO air power would never entirely go out. It remains one of the most unlikely, yet most profoundly successful deterrents of the Cold War era.